If truth is universal, why do humans fight as if it can be owned, defended, or possessed? This question exposes a fundamental contradiction in how people relate to knowledge and belief. In everyday language, truth is treated as property. People speak of my belief, my ideology, my worldview, as if truth was something that could be claimed, protected, and inherited. Yet history and contemporary life show a consistent pattern. The stronger the claim of ownership over truth, the greater the conflict it generates. Competing claims rarely lead to understanding. Instead, they produce fragmentation, hostility, and mutual exclusion. This suggests that the problem may not lie in truth itself, but in how truth is cognitively framed. A crucial distinction must therefore be made between truth as reality and truth as representation. Reality exists independently of any individual perspective, while representation is shaped by perception, language, and context. Ibn Arabi argues that truth cannot belong to anyone because belonging itself is a limitation imposed by perception. Truth reveals itself through perspectives, but it is never contained by them. The modern intellectual environment intensifies this problem. Societies are increasingly defined by ideological polarization, identity-based belief systems, and moral or intellectual absolutism. Positions are not merely held, they are defended as extensions of personal identity. Disagreement is no longer interpreted as difference in perspective, but as threat in psychological terms. This reflects cognitive rigidity combined with identity fusion, a process in which beliefs become tightly bound to self-concept. When beliefs are challenged, the mind reacts defensively, as if the self itself were under attack. From a neuroscientific perspective, belief contradiction activates threat-related neural networks, particularly the amygdala, while reducing prefrontal cognitive flexibility. Under these conditions, reflective reasoning declines and emotional reactivity increases. The consequences are visible: chronic stress, social fragmentation, and an inability to engage with difference without hostility. Dialogue collapses into confrontation. Learning is replaced by defense. At its core, the problem is structural. Truth is treated as something to possess and protect, rather than something to encounter and understand. Ibn Arabi's thought offers a framework for explaining why this approach inevitably fails. Ibn Arabi is often mischaracterized either as a relativist who dissolves truth or as a mystic who abandons reason. Neither description is accurate. He is a systematic thinker concerned with the relationship between reality, perception, and knowledge. His work presents a rigorous epistemology grounded in the structure of consciousness. Central to his framework is the claim that reality, Al-Haqq, is infinite and self-disclosing, while human knowing is finite and perspective. This does not mean that knowledge is false, but that it is always partial. Ibn Arabi carefully distinguishes between truth itself and truth as grasped by a knower. Every act of knowing, he argues, is shaped by context, capacity, and the position of the observer. What is perceived is conditioned by the standpoint from which perception occurs. This anticipates modern observer-dependent models in philosophy of science, as well as contemporary discussions in cognitive science about situated cognition. In this view, error does not arise from having a perspective, but from mistaking perspective for totality. One of Ibn Arabi's central claims is that truth is disclosed rather than possessed. He uses the concept of ta'alluq, or self-disclosure, to describe how reality reveals itself to consciousness. Disclosure occurs relative to the perceived. What is received is always real, but never exhaustive. This aligns closely with findings in cognitive science. Perception is not a passive recording of reality. The brain actively interprets sensory input based on prior models, expectations, and context. In other words, perception is constructive. What you experience is shaped by how your cognitive system is organized at that moment. A useful real-world example comes from science itself. The same natural phenomenon can be explained through multiple models, each accurate within its domain. Classical mechanics, quantum mechanics, and relativistic physics offer different descriptions of reality, none of which fully cancel the others. Each model discloses something real, but none can claim absolute ownership. The key insight is this: partial access does not invalidate truth. Claiming total ownership does. Error begins when disclosure is mistaken for possession. Ibn Arabi repeatedly warns against confusing one's perception of truth with truth itself. When this confusion occurs, belief hardens into rigidity. Psychologically, this corresponds to identity-protective cognition, in which beliefs are defended not for their accuracy, but for their role in maintaining a stable self-image. Neuroscientific research supports this observation. Challenges to deeply held beliefs activate survival-related neural circuits, producing defensive responses that inhibit reflective reasoning. Under these conditions, evidence is evaluated selectively, and counter-information is dismissed regardless of its validity. Socially, the consequences are severe. Dialogue becomes impossible because disagreement is interpreted as hostility. Difference becomes threat. Communication shifts from understanding to domination. Ibn Arabi's corrective is precise. Truth does not require defense. Only identities do. Truth is not weakened by plurality, but identity is threatened by it. The more tightly truth is held as property, the less clearly it is perceived. One of Ibn Arabi's most challenging ideas is that apparently contradictory views may both reflect aspects of truth. This does not imply logical inconsistency in reality itself, but rather limitation at the conceptual level. Contradiction arises in language and thought, not in being. A modern analogy can be found in physics. Light behaves as both a wave and a particle, depending on the experimental frame. These descriptions appear contradictory, yet they refer to the same underlying phenomenon. The contradiction lies in the models, not in reality. Cognitively, this reflects frame-dependent understanding. Different conceptual frames highlight different features of the same phenomenon. When one frame is mistaken for total reality, conflict emerges. The implication is crucial. Disagreement does not necessarily imply falsehood. It implies limited perspective. Truth can appear plural at the human level without being fragmented at the level of reality itself. Ibn Arabi deepens his argument by examining the nature of the knower. The self, he argues, is not static. Consciousness changes from moment to moment, shaped by experience, attention, and internal states. From a psychological perspective, the self is better understood as a process rather than an entity. If the subject of knowing is constantly changing, permanent possession of truth becomes impossible. A changing subject cannot fully contain an unchanging reality. What changes over time is not truth itself, but the angle from which it is known. This explains why certainty often collapses under further reflection. New perspectives emerge, not because truth has changed, but because the knower has. Ownership presumes stability. Consciousness does not provide it. At this point, a paradox becomes clear. Absolute certainty, rather than strengthening knowledge, often weakens it. Cognitive science describes this through overconfidence bias, in which excessive certainty reduces error correction and openness to new information. Ibn Arabi locates certainty in reality, not in human claims. Reality functions regardless of belief. Human certainty, by contrast, is provisional and revisable. Recognizing this is not skepticism or relativism. It is epistemic humility and alignment with how knowledge actually operates. Openness, in this framework, is not weakness. It is cognitive accuracy. Blindness emerges not from uncertainty, but from premature closure. The practical implications of this perspective are substantial. One crucial shift is learning to hold beliefs as models rather than identities. This involves separating self-worth from correctness and allowing beliefs to evolve without threatening personal integrity. Psychologically, this reduces defensiveness and improves emotional regulation. Socially, it enables dialogue without domination and learning without threat. In professional domains such as science, ethics, leadership, and education, this approach supports adaptability and long-term understanding. The key distinction is commitment without attachment. One can be deeply committed to truth-seeking without claiming ownership over truth itself. In summary, truth does not belong to anyone because it is not an object. It is a process of disclosure shaped by perspective. Ibn Arabi dissolves the link between truth and ego, showing that conflict over truth arises from mistaking perspective for possession. When truth belongs to no one, understanding becomes possible. Disagreement no longer threatens reality, and difference no longer requires defense. What remains is not relativism, but clarity, a recognition of truth as something encountered, not owned.